Our English Heritage, Key Documents and Philosophies. The Great Charter, otherwise known as the Magna Carta, was published in 1215. It came about by rebellious nobles who had their own ideas for government. They were weary of King John's heavy taxes and wanted protection against arbitrary or random cruel acts of the king. It was the first document to be forced upon a king, and it limits the king's power. For example, the king could no longer levy taxes without the consent of Parliament. This means that the king had to go through Parliament if he wanted to raise taxes. This was very important because King John had been raising taxes to use the money for his own benefit. The power to tax is the power to control. If the king put a 90% tax on a person's wages, that person would have a terrible life. He would hardly be able to buy food for him or his family, or he may just go without food. The Magna Carta gives Parliament more power than it had in the previous decades. The Charter paved the way for other constitutional laws because it had fundamental rights such as trial by jury and the protection against the random taking of life, liberty, or property. The Magna Carta was the first form of limited government. The Petition of Right was passed in 1628 by Parliament after King Charles I violated many laws. King Charles asked Parliament for more taxes and money, but Parliament would only agree if the king signed the petition. The Petition of Right limited the power of the king. Parliament said that the king could no longer place more taxes on the people without Parliament's permission. He could no longer imprison people or punish people without just cause. This meant that people are punished by the law of the land, not the wrath of the king. King Charles had forced the civilians to house his troops, both to save money and to punish his opponents. The petition made quartering troops without the homeowner's permission illegal. Not being forced to quarter troops was a very important freedom because the people did not want to be forced to house and feed the army. Quartering troops was an invasion of their privacy. Also, the king can no longer declare martial law during a time of peace. Since all of these documents have been limiting the power of the king, he would declare martial law and take away the rights of the people. Martial law is military rule. Essentially, the government takes over every aspect of civilians' lives. They can take away civil rights such as freedom of speech and right to assemble. For example, the king could put and set a curfew and arrest those who violate the curfew. The freedoms that martial law take away are very important because they are natural rights that all humans should have, such as the freedom to speak what is on your mind. Since the king could no longer declare martial law when the country was not in war, and Parliament had to approve any wars in the first place, this meant that the people did not have to worry that their freedoms could be taken away. The main reason for the Petition of Right is to challenge the divine right of the king. No longer is the monarchy above the law of the land. William and Mary of Orange were given the crown by Parliament after many years of turmoil and revolt, known as the Glorious Revolution. To prevent any abuse of power by William and Mary, or future monarchs, Parliament drew up the English Bill of Rights in 1689. It offered all Englishmen certain rights such as freedom from excessive bail and freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. Excessive bail was put in place to keep people in jail if they couldn't pay for their bail, which most couldn't. The bill also limited the power of monarchs by prohibiting a standing army in peacetime, without Parliament's consent. Many other laws had to now be passed through Parliament first, like suspending laws and levying money for the use of the crown. Parliament also now had free, regular elections in order to give free speech to the people. Free speech in Parliament meant that the people of England now had a small say in what laws they wanted and which ones they didn't. The two treatises of government were published by John Locke in 1689. The treatises explained a civil society in which Locke argues that all men are created equal in nature by God. Every man has a right to life, liberty, and property. Locke states that if a government is ruled without the consent of the people, then the people can overthrow the government. Locke's philosophies are later seen in the Declaration of Independence. England and America heading towards divorce. The Stamp Act was passed in 1765, and it was the first direct tax imposed on colonists. It required the colonists to pay a tax on any legal document, cards, newspapers, etc. A stamp was then put on the item to show that the tax had been paid. These taxes were widely denounced, not only for being expensive, but also because it was taxation without representation. After all of the colonies except Georgia, New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Virginia, met in New York and prepared and sent to the king a protest against the stamp tax, called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. This Stamp Congress was the first time a significant number of colonies joined together in opposition of the monarchy. After this, new laws were passed to keep ties with the colonies. Because of this, colonists boycotted or refused to buy English goods. The Boston Massacre took place on March 5, 1770, after tensions had arisen between the British Army and the colonists. On December 16, 1773, a group of men, who called themselves the Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Native Americans and dumped 352 chests of tea off British ships in the Boston harbor. The Intolerable Acts were passed in 1774. The main part of the Intolerable Acts is that it closed the Boston harbor until the people of Boston could pay back the damage to the tea. This outraged the people because they felt it was unfair to punish all of Boston when only a handful of people had caused the damage. Closing of the harbor meant that the people of Boston could not get food, medical supplies, or other items that they needed. The Intolerable Acts also called for quartering the troops. This meant that the citizens of Boston had to house British troops. Since the Boston Massacre, there had been a lot of tension between the people and the British Army. Since the Boston harbor had been closed, the British troops had been stationed in Boston. On April 15, 1775, the army moved towards Lexington. Paul Revere had been sent to ride to Lexington and alert the Minutemen that the British are coming, the British are coming. However, Paul didn't actually say this. Because of the amount of British troops in the cities, Paul Revere actually said, "The regulars are coming, the regulars are coming." The regulars were the British Army. At the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. The first shot became known as the shot heard round the world. The Second Continental Congress met in 1775, soon after the American Revolution began, and it included delegates from all 13 colonies. This Congress managed the war effort and made George Washington commander of the Continental Army. The Congress also raised taxes and made formal treaties. The Second Continental Congress moved closer and closer to independency, and finally, on July 4, 1776, signed the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson and listed grievances that colonists had with the king. Documents like the English Bill of Rights and John Locke's treaties influenced Jefferson while he was writing the Declaration of Independence. The English Bill of Rights is similar in that they both list grievances against the British king. The English Bill of Rights was grievances against King James II, and the Declaration of Independence was grievances against King George III. John Locke's treatises are similar in that Locke's ideas are reflected in the preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.